Saturday's shooting at the Trump rally in Butler County, Pennsylvania, it was one of those generational moments. It was the kind of thing that everyone takes note of, everyone has thoughts and emotions related to, and everyone can generally recall where they were when they learned of it. Look, before going into my own thoughts about the broader crime and President Trump himself, I want to make special note that an innocent supporter was killed. Another was wounded. 2 people and their families and friends had their lives altered and even ended simply because they chose to support a man who had already overwhelmingly been supported by millions of voters in a competitive Republican primary. God bless them. Let's not forget their legacy in the middle of everything else. With that said, there's so much we could talk about in regards to what happened on Saturday. But I want to address just one key aspect, just one key aspect in the midst of the entire thing of the shooting in Pennsylvania. Look, 5 months ago, I did a monologue on my radio show. I called it Bull Moose Gravitas, and it fits what we saw now more than ever. I decided it was needed for a refresh in light of what we saw Saturday at the Trump rally. President Trump was shot Saturday while giving a speech as normal as any of the hundreds he's given in the last decade. As the sound of the shots rang out, he noticeably grabbed the right side of his head, and for what we now know, it was a round that creased his ear. Just millimeters of space saved his life. Secret Service converged on the president as he dropped to the stage floor. But in a moment that will remain frozen in time, we watched him come to his feet, and over the heads of the protective detail, he shook his fist in the air, and no less than 3 times he yelled the word fight. It was an epic moment. Maybe even a defining moment. In one split second, we saw everything was devastating, but the response from Trump was exactly what the world needed right at that time. It was command presence. It was leadership. And y'all, a leader's presence matters. It matters a lot. I've said before that sometimes it's important that not only does the person in charge provide good decision-making and quality management, care for his or her people, good policies, but that the leader also inspires others. The Romans, the ancient Romans, they looked to certain characteristics. They gave them names like pietas, which denoted a regard for discipline and authority, or virtus, which had connotations of valor and masculinity and excellence and courage and strong character. And then there was gravitas, which meant that somebody was sincere and carried themselves with authority. The Romans actually wrapped all 3 of those things up and several more into a concept they called Romanitas. It was like saying that if someone wanted to represent Rome to the world, then these characteristics needed to be evident in them. In other words, they saw their leaders as being representative of who they are as a people, not the other way around. In ancient Rome, Romanitas was everything. You had it or you didn't. It was said by some historians that the embodiment of Romanitas is what led to the concepts that we now call self-governance, because the people of Rome believed in themselves. They trusted themselves. They had leaders worth following. Romanitas was a part of what inspired what became known later as classical republicanism. During the Renaissance period, the writings of Rome's Cicero and Greek writers Aristotle and Polybius, they embodied the traits of liberty and rule of law and anti-corruption and civil society and patriotism, and it all stemmed, at least in part, from the days of Romanitas. Look, back in 2012, when I was serving in the Alabama State Senate, it was an election year. I had the opportunity to meet several of the Republican presidential candidates personally. One of those that I met and who I actually really admired was former Texas Governor Rick Perry. I told Governor Perry at the time I was looking for a God-fearing gunslinger in the executive office. And he smiled and said, "I'm both of those things." Now, what does that mean, though? I mean, policies, those are huge, and they're key. They're very important. Policies oftentimes mean more than personality, but we also need a person with the strength and the presence to rise to the moment. Someone who is not faint of heart. Someone who can care about people and direct traffic with the authority of their position all at the same time. Someone who operates decisively while also listening to wise and carefully selected counsel. Somebody who's hard to brief because they've already studied the issues, but they still hear the presentation and they ask all the right questions. Somebody who will admit mistakes and tell you what it will take to ensure they never happen again. I don't think we have much of that available in the public arena right now. And in my opinion, there is certainly not much of that in the White House right now. In the military, we call it command presence. It involves the actual person of the leader, not just their resume, not any number of medals they might wear on their chest, not how loud they can yell or what position they currently hold. When a military unit has a leader who carries a solid command presence, it implies that the troops look to that person because they embody what the junior ranks want to be like. They see the charisma, the strength of personality, the self-confidence, the individual magnetism that a leader can project. All of that combined with the skill set necessary to do the job makes for a command presence. And when that leader walks in the room, people know it. When somebody else gives an order, it's not uncommon for them to use the commander's name because it carries weight. That kind of leadership presence, it's elusive, it's hard to pinpoint. It can certainly be developed, but it's also sometimes inherent in the character of the person who has it. We don't have any of that virtus or pietas or gravitas in the Oval Office right now, not a lick of it. Joe Biden, he cannot for a second claim to have the embodiment of Romanitis in the American sense. Videos abound of President Biden looking lost and losing his words or checking his notes as to what to say or having his own words walked back by his staff. He often appears frail and defeated. His voice is small and raspy. Foreign leaders don't respond well to him, and we hear that some don't return his calls. And I have to ask if maybe the Romans had it right, that a leader should embody what we as a people want to be seen as by the rest of the world. Is it too much to ask for us to have a leader who has more than just good policies? Can't we also find somebody who inspires our confidence? Somebody in whom we are proud of as a people when he represents us as a people. So ask yourself this. When the leaders of other nations see our president, do they see America? Who are we? Are we still rough and ready? Are we still industrious cowboys? Are we still maverick innovators? Are we the nation that can be counted on? Are we the nation who answers the call of our friends and tells the bullies of the world to back off? Are we a nation that has gravitas? If you believe that we are, then shouldn't our leadership also reflect that? Look, we can think back to great leaders in our history, Thomas Jefferson, Abraham Lincoln, Ronald Reagan. But back again to that monologue that I told you I gave exactly 5 months ago. In fact, 5 months to the day that Trump was shot. I told in that monologue about one of my favorite moments of presidential gravitas that occurred just over 111 years ago. An incident that occurred that firmly established that command presence is one of the characteristics looked for in a president. In 1910, Teddy Roosevelt was vying to become president for a third term. There had been a 4-year gap in his service, and he had just lost a heated primary to Republican President William Taft at a contested Republican convention. But populism was with Roosevelt. The people loved him. So in classic Roosevelt fashion, he formed his own party, and he christened it the Progressive Party, which is not really a name that most conservatives would cotton to today, but there it was. Roosevelt, though, he was a force of nature. He was a personality that could not be contained. He was a doer. But he was also one who would only ask of others what he was willing to do himself. Like him or not, Roosevelt had command presence, and he was the embodiment of American gravitas. So on October 14th of 1912, Roosevelt stepped out of his hotel in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. He got into an open-top car to take the short drive to an auditorium where he was scheduled to give a campaign speech. Crowds were gathered outside the hotel, cheering loudly when he came out. So in classic Roosevelt fashion, he stood up in the back of his town car to wave at the crowd. But unbeknownst to everyone, there was a man named John Schrank, who believed that a former dead president had spoken to him in a dream and told him he had to kill Roosevelt, so he was waiting with a .38 caliber pistol. Schrank shot Roosevelt in the chest at close range, as close as a few feet. But a copy of Roosevelt's speech was in his pocket and his eyeglass case, and those two things helped slow the bullet down somewhat. Nonetheless, Roosevelt was knocked down and the bullet entered into his chest cavity. But the recounting of the event, it doesn't stop there. It is said that Roosevelt himself saw the crowd attempting to beat the shooter, who was obviously out of his mind, and Roosevelt, just having been shot, actually intervened and shouted down the angry mob saying, "He doesn't know what he's doing, don't strike the poor creature." The Library of Congress, recounting the event years later, says the injured and bleeding Roosevelt himself was, quote, able to restore order to the chaos at the scene before the police even arrived and took Schrank into custody. But at that point, though, you'd think, okay, he's going to the hospital, right? No. Roosevelt insisted on going on to give his speech, which he did while bleeding profusely through his clothes. speaking with vigor and energy for nearly an hour and a half. It was only after the speech that Roosevelt, who had become wobbly from loss of blood, was taken to a hospital. He was asked a little bit later by reporters how he was doing. "I'm fit as a bull moose," he said. And at that point, the phrase caught on. And from then on, the so-called Progressive Party that he had formed to run for president became known as the Bull Moose Party. And Teddy Roosevelt, a man who had led the Rough Riders up San Juan Hill in the Spanish-American War, he became even more legendary. He was a rough and ready, take-no-prisoners kind of guy. His charisma wound up becoming more popular than the Republican president, Taft, who had bested him at the convention. The Bull Moose Party, with Teddy Roosevelt, it actually carried more states than Taft's Republicans. But unfortunately for them, it served as a spoiler candidacy. It opened up the door to Democrat Woodrow Wilson. But Bull Moose Roosevelt is also the reason why Woodrow Wilson won that election with the lowest percentage of any popular vote in U.S. history at just 42%. It was gravitas. The people could care less what the establishment of the day wanted at the convention. They wanted some Bull Moose gravitas. He embodied what the majority of Americans wanted their country to be known as. Look, people want a leader who inspires confidence. I would also say that the people of this great nation, we actually deserve a leader that will inspire confidence. Someone who, even when we don't agree on policy, can effectively articulate their position. Someone who leads us to believe that if a fast-paced, dangerous situation arose in the dark of night, that they would be able to respond quickly and resolutely and effectively. Someone who leads us to believe that they have a plan that involves the greater good. You can set aside Biden's policies right now. Just stop thinking about them. Just focus for a second on the man himself who sits in the Oval Office. Just tell me if you would follow him anywhere. Look, command presence, gravitas, it's a thing. It matters. And it is missing right now. Maybe we ought to coin the new version of Romanitis and call it emeritus. We need good policies, absolutely, we do. But we also need someone who looks and sounds like someone who embodies the way we as a nation want to be seen. We need some bull moose gravitas. We need some command presence. We need a God-fearing gunslinger. So God bless President Trump. God bless America. That's my philosophy.